Hi, everyone. Welcome to the beginning of our Falls Month, which is, I know I am really excited for. We've got a whole bunch of really amazing topics and speakers. We started off this morning with Rabbi Silver, and now we've got our first guest lecturer, Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens, who is the Associate Professor in the Philosophy Department at the University of Haifa, and also an Orthodox rabbi and Jewish educator. Sam's academic interests span the philosophy of religion, metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. And he is also the co-founder and served as the founding chair of the Association for the Philosophy of Judaism. And this class is about the Midrash on the Parashah. And every week, we're gonna discuss different midrashim connected to that week's Parashah, Torah portion, and that's going to give us insight into the Rabbinic imagination, which I'm really excited for. Before we begin, I just want to, for a newsman, go over some of our usual guidelines, which is I will be inviting a whole bunch of our participants to be a panelist. No pressure. That does not mean you have to talk. That doesn't mean you have to contribute. It just means that if you want to, you'll be able to turn on your camera. We'd love to see your face. And if you'd like, you can raise your hand, ask questions. Dr. Lebens will tell us how he will be taking those questions. You can also put them in the chat and I will pass them on for you. Please stay muted when you're not speaking. And you'd also be able to, if you're watching on Facebook, you can ask in the comments and I'll pass those questions on for you. And I think that's all of our housekeeping for now. So Dr. Lebens.
Perfect. Thank you, Chaya. So this is the first week and our semester, and I will try and be in a place with more illumination next week. It's a bit dark in here, and there are children in various other rooms in the house. And it's my pleasure to be here with Drisha and to be opening the semester with you. I also have a handout for today's session. Chaya gave a thorough introduction as to what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at midrashim each week, organized around the weekly parasha. And my hope is that I'll probably not be unpacking necessarily the original intention of the authors of the midrashim, always. In a sense, I think what you'll see is I'll be stringing together midrashim and kind of creating a meta midrash on midrash. And the hope is that in so doing, we together will get a taste of what it really means to be midrash, what midrash is. So we'll be looking at midrash midrashically. And what I want to start with, there is a handout for today's class, but it's not necessary for you to have it open the whole time unless you want to. I want to start with the first source on the handout, which is a verse from this week's Parashah. Okay, so I don't want to assume any prior knowledge about what's happening in the weekly Parashah, the weekly Torah reading, and I also don't want to assume any prior knowledge about what Midrash is. So let me just say a little bit about that, although I'm going to be pressed if you want to fit in all the things I want to say on Parashat Noach. Midrash, as a word, refers to a mode of rabbinic commentary on text, a kind of creative commentary on text, but we also use the word midrash kind of with a capital M to refer to collections of rabbinic commentaries on texts. All of these collections were redacted, edited between, and this is a long period of time, around the 2nd century CE, all the way down to about the 13th century in the Middle Ages. So you have earlier and later collections of midrashim. Some of the midrashim are called the halachic midrashim, and their job is, the halachic midrashim, their job is to uncover how the laws of the biblical laws of rabbinic Judaism, that's to say the laws that the rabbis relate to as biblical, where do we find them in the text? Because it's not always the case that you say, oh, you know, there's a biblical law, you're not allowed to tear paper on the Sabbath. Try and find that in the Bible. It's not written anywhere. So the halachic midrash is the rabbinic attempt to uncover the sources of biblical law in the biblical text. We will look at some halachic midrashim through the course, but I suppose the more famous and more appealing, perhaps, type of midrash is called midrash agadah, which is a more narrative-based midrash. And like I said, I'm hoping we'll get more of a sense of what the rabbis are up to when they write Midrash by just diving into some. So with that background in place, I said we're going to look at a verse in the Bible. It's chapter 8, verse 16 of the book of Genesis, so Parashah, in this week's Torah reading. And it's after the context of this verse is it's after Noah has experimented by sending out a raven and a dove to search for dry land. It's after the ark has come to rest on the mountains of Ararat. It's after Noah has opened the window of his ark to see for himself that the waters had receded. After all of that, in verse 16 of chapter 8, God speaks to to Noah, saying, there's a lot of Moses-Noah parallels in Midrash, but we're actually not going to look at that. God speaks to Noah, saying, Say min hateva, ata ve'ishtachal vanecha u'neshevanecha itach. Get out the ark, together with your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives. And I just want to focus on this verse. Noah knows that the flood is finished, right? He's like checked this almost neurotically, right? First of all, he'll know that the ark is no longer kind of rocking at sea, right? It's come to rest on a mountain. He sent out birds. He's opened the window. He's taken a look. Why does he wait in the ark until God has to come to him and say, get out? I think the implication is that despite all of his experiments and his certainty that the danger had gone, Noah actually wouldn't leave. He wouldn't leave the ark without an explicit commandment. Now, on some readings of Noah's personality, you might expect this from the text. Right? So one of my teachers, Rabbi Waxman, who's a really fabulous Tanakh teacher and Gemara teacher and Halacha teacher, who's taught in many institutions, I'm almost certain he taught in Drisha years ago. He writes, he used to do a weekly Parashah class on the virtual midrash of Yeshiva Patzion. He writes that the Bible, it tells us, you don't need Rabbi Dr to tell us this, the Bible tells us that Noah was righteous and that he walked with God and he found favor in God's eyes. But beyond these blanket assertions of Noah's righteousness, and this is what Rav Waxman uncovers, the Torah also has a subtler way of describing Noah's religious persona. Right? It's in the narrative of the construction of the ark. God's commandments and instructions are invariably followed by an explicit assertion right throughout chapter 6 and chapter 7 of the book of Genesis as Noah is building his ark. It keeps repeating again and again, Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did. Okay, so it's like the narrative keeps banging home. Noah is a guy who follows commands. Noah is a guy who's followed commands. I commanded him, he did it. I commanded him, he did it. So Rabbi Waxman teases out the significance of this narrative device. And I could have actually had this quote on the handout. It's a quote now from Rabbi Waxman. He said, the term command and its Hebrew root has appeared only in one other context until this point. Can anyone guess where that is? Where has the word command appeared before Noah is commanded to build the ark? Looking in the chat.
Parashah for Adam.
Adam, right? The command of not eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Good. That's the only time we've heard of a command until Noah, and it didn't go well, right? They didn't keep it, right? So Rav Waxman continues, right? God inquires whether Adam had eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from. So that's the first instance of the word command. But unlike Adam and Eve, who proved themselves incapable of obeying the simple command of not eating a particular fruit, I'm still reading from Rav Waxman, he says, Noah proves himself capable of obeying the most arduous commands. Noah doesn't evade, he doesn't disobey, he doesn't even reply. God just says, build an ark. Like Noah's walking down the street one day, he's never heard from God before, and God's like, Noah, Noah's like, who was that? And God says, it's me, God, build an ark. And Noah doesn't even say, pardon. He just does it. He does everything he's told to do. Rabbi Waxman continues, he simply carries out God's word no matter how Herculean the task. No matter the size of the boat, the number of the animals to be gathered, or the amount of food to be collected, Noah's uniqueness lies not just in his uprightness and morality, but also in his obedience to the command of God. Right? So Noah's religious persona is typified by quiet, unquestioning obedience, right? Subservience to God's will. Now, it's interesting that in a well-known stream of midrashic thought, which I will touch on, in fact, I'm about to touch on it now, but which won't be the focus of today, Noach is criticized for this. He's criticized for his unquestioning observance, his subservience, right? And the locus classici, the famous location where this a line of criticism emerges, is when the Torah describes Noach in chapter 6, verse 9, as righteous in his generation. At that point, well, it's well known that Rashi, the medieval, commentator on the Parashah par excellence, Rashi cites there a Talmudic debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And Rabbi Yochanan says, that's not praise. If Noach had lived in another generation, he wouldn't have been considered righteous. Reish Lakish takes the other side and says, no, this is tremendous praise. Like, imagine what it takes to be righteous in the midst of depravity and all the things that Noach must have seen and been exposed to. Now, the negative side of this machloket, of this debate, Rav Yochanan's side, according to which Noach isn't really praiseworthy for his unquestioning observance, is magnified in later rabbinic tradition. And the Zohar is not a text we're going to turn to very often in this course. I think this might be the only time we do. The Zohar is thought to be, the foundational text of a type of Kabbalistic Judaism, a foundational mystical text, but actually a lot of it reads like Midrash on weekly Parashah. And of course, we can debate when exactly was it written. Some on the more literalist side of the Orthodox world would like to say that it was only revealed in the 1200s or whenever it was revealed, that it was actually the words of Shimon Bar Yochai. But it doesn't really matter to us when it was written. It reads like Midrash. It belongs to the same kind of genre in many places. And I just want to share with you here. So it's on the handout. And this is where you see kind of Rabbi Yochanan's side of the machloket accentuated, perhaps to the greatest extreme. It says, Noach lo hagin al doro v'lo hitpalel aleihim ka'Avraham. Noach, he wasn't so good. He didn't defend his generation. He didn't pray for them, as Avraham did, right? When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Avraham, now I'm just reading from the English translation of the Zohar, when the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Avraham that he was about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, immediately Avraham stood up and prayed before the Holy One, blessed be he. To the extent that he asked whether if 10 good people could be found, if 10 good men could be found, would God forgive the entire place because of them? Later, and it's interesting here, the progression. You see, Avraham prays for the wicked, but only in virtue of the righteous among them. Right? If there are 10 righteous people, then maybe you could save the whole place, God. How about it? Right? Moshe prays for the generation who actually, according to the Zohar, kind of deserved to be wiped out. The generation of those who worshipped the golden calf, right? Moshe doesn't say, "Oh, forgive them" on the dovetails, the coattails of the righteous. Moshe says, "Yeah, maybe they're all wicked. I don't know, but I want you to forgive them anyway." Right? So the Zohar continues to Moshe and says, later Moshe came, he prayed for and defended his generation. When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, "They have strayed quickly from the way in which I commanded them." Immediately, Moshe stood and prayed. Right? So the Rabbi Yochanan side of the debate, the Rabbi Yochanan side that says, yeah, Noach, okay, he was good, but compared to other people, not so good, right? It likes to jump on Noach's particular type of religiosity. It's an unquestioning religiosity. Now, Noach, it's worth pointing out, is not Jewish, is pre-Judaism, right? And you might think that Judaism is typified by a much more audacious type of religiosity, a religiosity that's willing to challenge God, right? So in fact, we are the children of Israel. Jacob gets the name Israel after he fights with an angel, and the not quite accurate etymology, but the etymology that the Bible gives to the name Israel is that kisarita, that you struggled with the divine and with the human, and you prevailed. What it is to be Jewish, to be a member of Israel, is to be willing to kind of even fight against the divine when things don't make sense to you. But like Isaac in that fight, like Israel in that fight with the angel, not to let it go until it blesses you, right? So Abraham was willing to argue with God for the sake of the innocent. Moshe was, as we've said, even more strident because he was willing to put his own legacy on the line. He actually said, as it's well known, he would rather be blotted out of God's book than to watch God punish the children of Israel. And as the Zohar goes on to claim later on, Moshe was even praying, as I said, for a community that in a sense deserved to be punished. He wasn't merely praying in the hope that there were some innocent people who could redeem the rest or something. He was more daring even than Abraham. Moshe wouldn't have stopped praying just because there weren't 10 righteous people to pray for. So you get Noach. Better than Noach is Abraham. Better than Abraham is Moshe. Now, Noach's subservience, according to the Zohar, is what renders his variety of righteousness less praiseworthy than the forms of righteousness to be seen in later generations, because Noach doesn't question what God tells him to do. There's clearly something good about that, right? He did exactly what God had done, no matter how Herculean the task, Rav Waxman pointed out. But ultimately, God's wiping out men, women, and children, and Noach doesn't stand up and say anything, right? So on this reading of Noach's personality, right, it's not surprising that Noach wouldn't leave the ark without an explicit commandment, right? He doesn't do anything until he's told to, right? And indeed, there is a midrash that kind of emphasizes this matter. Now, I want you to know, I told you I'm not going to always be following the authorial intent of every midrash. The next midrash I'm going to look at is Midrash Tanchuma. Now, Midrash Tanchuma is a very famous medieval collection of midrashim, redacting what we know to be much earlier traditions. It very often echoes Midrash Rabbah, which is a different collection of midrashim. Rashi cites Midrash Tanchuma, but there are two versions of Tanchuma: the more standard version that Rashi seemed to have, and then a version called the Buba version. And it's called the Buba because it was the manuscripts were discovered in the 19th century by a certain Buba. I don't think it was Martin Buber, I think it was a different Buber. And there's a beautiful midrash that, as I said, I'm taking a little bit out of context because in the full context, and you can go and look at the midrash is available on Sefaria.com. Is it .com or .org? Sefaria, one of the two. You can find the midrash in context, and you'll see that the midrash is quite clearly trying to praise Moshe. Noah, sorry. This midrash is supposed to praise Noah. But if you take just the last few lines, like I'm doing, it's almost comic, right? So it says, Amru lo banav neit selan, right? The sons of Noah said, "Come on, Noah, what are you waiting for? Let's go!" Right? You've sent out the raven, you've sent out the dove, you've opened the window. We haven't been moving anywhere. Let's get out, right? And Amar lahem chas v'shalom, God forbid, Noah says to them, right? We only came in here on God's command, right, or God's permission. And we're not leaving till God tells us to. And it was only when God heard this, he he quickly gave them permission. That's when God, it's almost like God wasn't going to tell Noach to leave because it was pretty obvious that he had to leave, right? Until he heard Noach say, I'm not going anywhere until God tells us to go. What a love. Okay, fine, I'll tell him to leave, And I think there is almost something comical about it. Like, even though actually in the context, like I told you, Noach is being praised as a trusty servant of God, it's almost extended by these rabbis to a level of absurdity. And I think that's what they want us to see, almost something funny in the text, right? Here is a servant of Hashem, so lacking in his own initiative that even when it's clear to everybody that something has to be done, he's not willing to do it, not without an explicit command, a command that God himself hadn't thought necessary to issue until, so to speak, he realized that Noach wouldn't budge without being told to. Right? It's hard not to sympathize in this case, I think, with the frustration of his children in this text, right? It's hard not to hear the frustration echoing in the words of God himself in this midrash. But this isn't the only way to understand the commandment to leave the ark. Right? It's far from obligatory. Remember, there's Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish thinks of Noach as great, right? And perhaps he'd have been even greater than Abraham and Noah, Abraham and Moshe, had he only lived in a different generation, right? I think it's far from obligatory that we read passive submission into the character of Noah, despite the rabbinic pedigree of this school of thought. In fact, I think we can easily resist the comparison that renders Abraham more praiseworthy in this respect, and Moshe even more praiseworthy. Why? Because think about it. The claim that Abraham is willing to argue with God's commandments loses a lot of its force. When? When does this claim, oh, Abraham will argue with God, when does it lose a lot of its force? Think of the story of Abraham. He's commanded to take his son up a mountain and kill him. And he doesn't argue, right? So, oh, Abraham is the one who fights against God. Well, he does for Sodom and Gomorrah, but not from himself. So I found quite an obscure text that relates to this. There's a very famous rabbi, of course, Chaim Shmulevitz. This text is by, I think, a distant relation called Rabbi Yitzchak Shmulevitz, who lived from 1898 until 1941. He died in the Holocaust. He was murdered. And he has a book called Mimkor HaNetzach. And he has this beautiful quote there where he points out that Moshe argued with God about whether or not he should be let into the land of Israel. How do we know that? Because he prayed to enter the land. So when told of God's edict that he wouldn't reach the promised land, he prayed, said, oh, please let me in. And yet, decades later, when Moshe is commanded to ascend the mountain to his death, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 32, he doesn't try to argue his case. Why? And this is what Rav Shmulevitz says. This is a quote translated into English. He says, when Moshe heard from the Holy One, blessed be he, die on the mountain that you will ascend, he saw in this the opportunity to comply with a mitzvah aseh, with a positive commandment, and he accepted it with love. The idea I'm getting at, and this I think is Rav Yitzchak Shmulevitz's idea, is that when God reveals things to his prophets, then they'll often question, argue back, debate, and even protest. But when God commands a righteous person, then he or she obeys without question. So when Abraham was told of God's plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he protests. But when he's commanded to sacrifice his son, obeys without protest. When Moshe was told of God's plan to wipe out the Jewish people, and when he was told of God's plan to prevent him from reaching the promised land, he protested. But when he was commanded to ascend the mountain, to his death, then he obeyed without question. Now, the thing is, Noah wasn't told about God's plans, not in isolation from a commandment. Rather, he was commanded, build an ark because I'm going to send a flood. And in those situations, we don't expect a prophet to answer back, according to Yitzchak Shmulevitz. So what we've got on the one side is the Zohar saying, oh, Avram's great, he argues. Moshe's great, he argues. Noah, Nebuch, the non-Jewish kind of subservient model of religiosity. No, Avraham and Moshe, according to Yitzchak Shmulevitz, would have done exactly the same thing in Noah's situation. When you're commanded, it's not the place or time to answer back. Prophets only answer back when something has been revealed to them, not in the context of the command. So I think that's an important point, because it kind of maybe explains why Reish Lakish still has a horse in this race. Reish Lakish can still say, no, don't disparage Noah too much. So accordingly, and despite the richness of the interpretative tradition in question, we're not compelled to read excessive submissiveness into the character of Noah. But if Noah isn't understood in this light, then our question comes back, right? How are we to make sense of God's seemingly, I love this word, otios commandment to leave the ark, right? He didn't mean to tell him to leave the ark, it was obvious to leave the ark. So why did God have to tell him to leave the ark? And if we don't think that Noah was this kind of Nebuch subservient, God, then the question comes back. So there's another possible interpretation, which also draws from the Zohar. I don't quote this inside on the handout, but the Zohar likens the ark to a sukkah, right? The hut, we should all know what sukkot are at this time of year. We've just left them. It's the huts that the Jews dwelled in during their wandering in the wilderness. It's the huts that we rebuild and dwell within each year during the festival of Sukkot. But the sukkah itself represents, as is well known in rabbinic thought, the divine presence that surrounds and protects us. Who would want to leave such a place? God wants us to populate the world, to build it, to sustain it, and to flourish in so doing. But sometimes there's a religious temptation to abstain from these worldly pursuits and to take refuge in places of holiness and religious rapture. But sometimes we have to leave the ark and get our hands dirty, tending to the world. There's a time for prayer and meditation. There's a time to be in the sukkah, surrounded by the clouds of glory. But there's also a time for action. Now, it doesn't matter that the water had receded, because life itself remains like a flood. Real life, with its tumult and constant insecurities. It's like living in the tempest and the waves of the deluge. The ark is a symbol of the security that can come from taking refuge in introverted forms of religious piety. It might even be a symbol of retreating into the ghetto. I remember when I was in yeshiva, my Rosh Yeshiva quoted this midrash, this Zohar, and said, you're living in an ark, but eventually you're going to have to leave. When you go to university and you get a job, you're not going to be in yeshiva forever. You're going to actually have to enter the world. But God doesn't want us to live, unless maybe you have a tafkid, a role to be an educator. He doesn't want us to live in the yeshiva. He doesn't want us to live in the ghetto. He wants us to take part in the world. And for that reason, Noach is commanded to leave the ark. And I'm saying this because I do find there's something satisfying about this reading symbolically. Okay? And one of the things you'll see in Midrash, it's not always the case that the authors of the Midrash are interested to know what really happened historically. They're interested in the symbolic resonance of a story and what the story should mean to us. There's a very, very beautiful poem by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, which is sung around Shabbat tables, Yom Shabbaton, right? Where we talk about the greatness of the day, and we say, Shabbat is the day on which the dove found rest. What that metaphor is saying is that the week of work, of engaging with the world around us, is like being bashed around by the waves of a flooded world. But on Shabbat, we find rest. We're like the dove that finds the olive tree and finally can put its feet down and rest on something holy. So I find something really satisfying about this, all this symbolism. And then you can say, and that's why Noach had to be commanded to leave, because there's something deep in us that wants to stay, surrounded by the clouds of glory. But the thing is, it really doesn't sit very easily, the symbolism, with the story itself, right? Because if we try to take the story literally, if only kind of for narratival purposes, right? I can't imagine that the ark could have been a nice place, right? I can't imagine that it would have really been a place that's conducive to prayer, meditation, study, right? And that's where the next midrash on our handout comes in, right? The midrash imagines quite vividly, and this is another beautiful thing about midrash. Sometimes midrash is really interested in the symbolism of the story. Sometimes the midrash is interested in no, come on. Let's take this seriously, as if it really happened, and imagine what it would have been like, right? And that's what we see in Midrash Tanchuma now, the more standard Tanchuma, not the Buber edition. Says, Amar Rabbi Levi, Kol otan 12 chodesh, lo tam ta'am shena. All those 12 months that they were in the ark, they didn't taste the taste of sleep. I love that expression. When you have a really good sleep and you wake up, you kind of taste sleep in your mouth. It's like, oh, it's good. Lo Noach v'lo banav. Noach and his sons, they didn't sleep at all. Shahayu skukin lazun at the bahima v'et ha'chaya v'et ha'ofa. So Rabbi Levi says, well, they couldn't sleep because they had too many obligations, right? They had to feed all these different animals, the domesticated animal, the wild animal, the birds. Rabbi Akiva, afilu, one second. Yeah, afilu shifshtin lefilon uschuchit lenemiot hichnisu biyadan lazunotan. Right, this is the foods that were needed for elephants and ostriches. Apparently, elephants eat tree branches. That much is unsurprising, but apparently ostriches eat glass beads. And they had to bring them in, right? So they had to. So the place was full of all of the different foods you had to take, right? And yesh behema she'ochelet lishtei sha'ot b'layla. There are some animals that eat like in the second hour of the night. V'yesh ochelet lishlosha. There are other animals that eat in the third hour of the night, right? So they're always feeding things. They had to like schlep loads of stuff. There's very little room on this ark. You've got to imagine the stench. You've got to imagine the noise, and you've got to notice that until Noach opened up this trapdoor window thing at the very end of the 12 months, if you look at the design of the ark, there was no natural light in it, right? It would have been hideous, right? And think more, right? Imagine as the rain starts to fall and everybody starts banging on the side of the ark to be let in when they realize what's happening, right? The whole experience, I think, would have just been from beginning to end a terrible trauma. Imagine even just the seasickness, right? In this dark, dank, smelly place where you can't go to sleep. Why would Noah want to stay inside the confines of the ark? If we're no longer looking at it symbolically. Once he knew that the whole wide world was once again open to him, surely such an ark couldn't function as a spiritual refuge. So why did he wait till he was commanded to leave? Now, of course, you could go back to Rabbi Yochanan and say, because he was a Nebuch guy who never does anything unless he's told to, he's got no initiative, right? But I want to come to a new reading. And I think the essence of this new reading is also there in Tanchuma Noach 9. We'll see that the last source on the handout, a different part of that chapter. But in order to come to this new reading, I want to take a little detour with you. Okay? So I realize I'm just talking at you. If you have any questions at any time, Chaya's watching it. She'll interrupt me. Every morning, okay, Jewish law mandates that the Jew gets up and prays the morning prayer before it's too late. Now, in non-egalitarian halachic Judaism, it's upon Jewish men, there's an obligation where possible to get out of bed and actually find a minyan and in halakhic egalitarianism, that's upon women too, with whom to pray. So it's not even just getting out of bed before it's too late and praying. You have to actually go to some trouble to find a quorum with whom to pray. And then there's this question that arises, right? What happens if you, God forbid, are literally clinically depressed? You see, I raise the question because even a mild depression can make it really hard to get out of bed, right? Now, it's not as if it's nice to lie in bed with one's melancholy. It's not as if it's enjoyable to wallow in that cloud and in the darkness that comes with the depression. On the other hand, there's still a sense in which the bed plays kind of two roles at once. It's the inability to get out of bed is a vivid symbol of the darkness that haunts a person who's depressed. But the bed is also, a comfort, literally and figuratively. So you can ask, right, halakhically, is a person suffering from depression obligated under Jewish law to get out of bed each and every morning? And if not, right, do they incur guilt, right, when they fail to get up in time for minyan? Right? And I want to tread lightly here because I'm not an expert, and clinical depression is a medical condition, and it's a disease that literally kills people, right? And yet it's an important halakhic question. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's not all that much Orthodox Jewish literature that deals with these questions, but it's a growing field. And thankfully, I think it's quite well known these days. A teacher, a friend of mine, Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig, has written a book about these issues, alongside a psychiatrist, the halakhic implications of various mental illnesses. And he develops in this book authoritative rulings based on all of his halakhic research and in conversation with all of the relevant medical advisors. And regarding our question about the person with depression, this is his ruling, and I'm paraphrasing. He says, of course, if a person has depression to such an extent that they simply can't function without constant support and supervision, then they can't be considered as falling under any halakhic obligations, perhaps whatsoever. People hospitalized with clinical depression. But a person with clinical depression, so long as their condition hasn't reached that sort of severity, is obligated by the laws of prayer, and they should strive to wake up in time, get out of bed, to pray with a quorum on time. But then Rav Rosenzweig makes what I think to be vital, but also really revelatory qualifications. Okay, first, a person in such a situation is only obligated if, and perhaps only to the extent, that the imposition of these obligations won't pose an obstacle to that person's recovery, right? Rav Rosenzweig points out that the very notion that a person is obligated to get up in the morning, right, when this presents him or her with a severe medical challenge, that could very well be detrimental to their health. So it could leave them with feelings of guilt and inadequacy that only exacerbate their psychiatric condition. So in those situations, a person's exempt. But the other qualification I think was really important. Rosenzweig points out that just as the imposition of obligations can sometimes pose an obstacle to recovery, so too in some situations can the removal of obligations. As he puts it, a person suffering from clinical depression, this is a quote of my translation into English. I think the book has actually simultaneously been translated into English and is available in English. And if not, it will soon be. But this is my translation. He writes, a person suffering from clinical depression sometimes needs routines and fixed goals that require him or her to get up in the morning. Accordingly, leaving the obligations of prayer in place can, in such a situation, help a person to alleviate his situation. So in other words, clearly the issues here are very delicate, and any actual halakhic ruling is going to have to take into consideration the very particular contours of any given medical situation at hand. But if a person is simply incapable of something, clearly no obligation. If telling a person that there's no obligation will be detrimental to their health, then we shouldn't tell them that they have no obligation. Because maybe telling them they have an obligation will actually help them. in some situations. So certainly, okay, when we do say that the obligation remains, and even if it really does remain, right, the person really shouldn't beat themselves up when their depression causes them to fail to live up to these obligations, even if they are in place. My teacher, again, Rav Hanoch Waxman, put it to me personally in correspondence really beautifully. He said, at best, the obligation to pray in a quorum is a rabbinical obligation. But to beat yourself up and to damage your sense of self-esteem, that is to be Pogea B'Tselem Elokim. It's to attack the divine image, which is a biblical prohibition. Okay? So a person shouldn't beat themselves up over these issues. But for our purposes, the reason I've taken you on this long detour is just that it's interesting to note that sometimes it's the imposition of obligation, routine, goals, regimen, and the like, that can be part of a person's therapy, right? The ark was a place of terrible darkness, but places of terrible darkness can sometimes be very difficult to leave, like the bed in the morning for a person struggling with depression. A depressive episode tends to make people want to curl up into their shell, to retreat into their beds, into themselves, into Noah's ark, even if it's a horrible place to be. And sometimes the thing that helps a person to begin to heal, to begin to find a way to climb out of that ark, is to hear a voice that they respect, a voice that they trust, calling upon them to do something, literally issuing them a command, right? Now, I want to focus on one more text that isn't a midrash before we come back to our midrash. And it's the Star of Redemption by Franz Rosenzweig. And it's there on the handout. Now, Rosenzweig was well aware that the whole notion of law and obligation can be crushing, and it can be stifling, right? But Rosenzweig made a distinction that I just think is so beautiful, and I think it can help us to make sense of the difference between the laws that we might find crushing and stifling and the laws that we might find liberating. Now, he uses a medieval distinction between what he calls, what the medievals called chukim and mitzvot. When the medievals use the word chukim, they often mean laws that have no rationale, versus mitzvot, which are laws that do have a rationale. But Rosenzweig uses this distinction slightly differently, right? He gets this distinction up and running with a kind of cool question. He looks at the Bible's injunction that we should love God. You should love the Lord your God. And he just thinks it seems like an absurd law. He writes, can love be commanded? Isn't love destiny and being deeply touched? And now it's being commanded, like God saying, love me, thou shalt love me. Well, I can do lots of things on command. I can jump on command. I can whistle on command. I can do whatever. But can I love you on command? Well, it depends. Like, who are you, right? What sort of relationship do we have? Right? I can't love someone on command, right? Love is about being deeply touched by another. It's about, in Rosenzweig's language, destiny. Right? No third party can command love or obtain it by force. My dad loved this T-shirt that he saw in America that said, beatings will continue until morale improves, right? Morale isn't the sort of thing that can be beaten into a person, right? Likewise, love. You can't force a person to love you. And then Rosenzweig answers his own question. He says, the commandment of love can only come from the mouth of the lover. Only the one who loves can say and does say, love me. If someone loves you, they love you, then their love says to you, please love me back. Right? And I understood this best, I think, when I first held my first child? Because you hold this completely innocent and vulnerable thing, and it just looks up at you. And in that look, you feel called upon. You feel called upon to love it. You feel called upon to have a responsibility over it, right? It's in the context of a relationship that you can say, oh yeah, somebody is calling upon me to love them. And it doesn't sound absurd anymore. From his mouth, says Rosenzweig, the mouth of the lover, in the context of this relationship, from his mouth, the commandment of love is no longer a strange commandment. It's nothing other than the voice of love itself. And what Rosenzweig goes on to do in this passage of the Star of Redemption is to say that chukim are laws as they might be found in a law book. You shall do this, you shall do that, you shall do this, you shan't do that. Mitzvot could be the very same things, but in the context of a relationship. So there's a chok that says, you shall pray the afternoon service at a certain time of day. But the mitzvah is when you see the sun descending towards the horizon, and because of the relationship you have with God and your Judaism and Jewish law, you feel called upon by that moment of the day to say the mincha prayer. Then it's no longer a chok, it's a mitzvah. A mitzvah is a law in the context of relationship. And according to Rosenzweig, you know, one of the central tasks of the Jewish religious persona is to take every law and transform it from being a chok to being a mitzvah. Every law could be one or could be the other, right? So with that in mind, we'll turn back to the Midrash in a second, right? As I've said, right, if a law book legislates love, doesn't make sense. But if a person's gaze kind of falls on you in the right way, then it can call upon you to love, right? Noach didn't want to leave on my midrash. I'm writing midrash here, but I hope you see how it's inspired by other midrashim, and you'll see, I think, the kernel of it in the final midrash. In my midrash, Noach didn't want to leave the dark confines of his ark for the opportunities of the new world. So God spoke to him. And in that voice, Noach heard the sort of obligation that can help a person to find meaning in the ruins of an imperfect world. He heard a commandment, a mitzvah rather than a chok. And therein lies perhaps the greatness that Reish Lakish sees in Noach. Because here is a person who can hear the voice of God in the midst of inner turmoil, in the despair of a dark night of the soul. And look, we see later on in the story that Noach stumbles again, right? He takes refuge in alcohol, and it seems like he abuses alcohol in chapter 9 after the story of the flood, right? Nobody said that this was going to be easy, right? And yet, after that incident in the tent, when he's drunk, and it's not very clear exactly what happened, Noach lived for another 350 years, right? So there's a lot of life after that. What I want you to do now is look at the final midrash on our handout. And it's actually the first sentence of Midrash Tanchuma Noach chapter 9. And the second sentence is the one we've already looked at, just above Franz Rosenzweig, right? So what follows this sentence is, Amar Rabbi Levi, all those 12 months, they were feeding them, they didn't sleep. That's what follows this line. Okay? And let's look at the line together. Stay minateva, leave the ark. Zeh she'amar hakatuv. This is something that Midrash loves to do. So this is what the verse really means. What's really happening, and you'll see, is a kind of midrashic hobby, where the rabbis take a verse from somewhere in Tanakh and they put it in the mouth of someone else. Okay, so here they take a verse from the book of Psalms, traditionally attributed to David, or at least most of the Psalms are traditionally attributed to David, King David. And they say, no, actually, Noach was the guy who first said this. Okay, and what is it? It's the verse that says, "Hotzi mimasger nafshi lahodot et shimcha bi yaktiru tzadikim ki tigmol alai," which means release me, release my soul from prison, so that I can give thanks to you. So that's like a prayer. Release me from the inner turmoil of my soul so I can praise you. And then he says, the righteous one day will crown themselves because of me, because you will deal bountifully with me. Says the Midrash, this was Noach speaking. Bring my soul out of prison refers to Noach, who is imprisoned in the ark. He was imprisoned in the ark and he prayed to God to release him. And what was the answer to that prayer? A commandment to leave the ark. According to this Midrash, as I'm reading it, and I put my hands up, perhaps very creatively, this was Noach's prayer. He prayed that Hashem would release him from his inner turmoil. And when he heard the voice of God in the midst of his pain, that helped him to be released. And it led him to reason that, one day the righteous will glory in me because they'll take comfort from the fact that if he could do it, then maybe so can we. That's how I read the Midrash. And what we've seen, I think, is a more subtle, less prominent thread of rabbinic thinking about Noach. You've got Rabbi Yochanan, who says, if Noach lived in some other time, he wouldn't have been so great. And we know that thread. That thread's very well known. Rashi quotes it, and that Zohar is quite famous. And there are other midrashic comparisons, and there's Talmudic comparisons between Noach and Avraham and between Noach and Moshe. And Noach never gets a good rap, right? We know that story. And it's very often told as a story of a meek servant of God, rather than the distinctively Jewish type of chutzpahdik servant of God who's willing to stand up against the divine command if needs be. But what I've tried to motivate is a different midrashic thread in which, first of all, by taking this Holocaust thinker, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmulevitz, and saying, well, hold on a minute. The fact that Moshe doesn't complain and doesn't protest, it doesn't truly set him apart from Moshe and Abraham, because it's a different context. It's the context of a command rather than just a revelation of will, right? So we can quiet the Rabbi Yochanan argument, and then we can look for the heroism in Noach. And where perhaps is the heroism? And it's a very, very subtle hint at the beginning of Midrash Tanchuma, chapter 9. It says, when the psalm says, release me from prison, my Lord, and one day people will glorify through me. It was Noach speaking. And the heroism is, he was in a terrible place. And it's difficult sometimes to leave terrible places. You'd think it's easy, but no, it's dafka. It's specifically very difficult sometimes to leave difficult places. And one thing that can be therapeutic when one is stuck in a difficult place, not always therapeutic, as Rav Rosenzweig pointed out, but sometimes therapeutic, is to hear the voice of a lover commanding you. And Noach heard it. He heard it in that perplexing commandment, Noach, get out of the ark. And a commandment that perplexed the other midrash that we saw. Like, why did God need to tell Noach to do that? Wasn't it obvious? No, it's not obvious, according to this midrash that I'm unpacking, because as the midrash itself explicitly says, Noach was in prison. To hear God's voice calling you in those sorts of times is a madrega, is a high level, something we could all aspire to. And that perhaps, this is the more speculative part, linking Midrash Tanchuma to Reish Lakish. Perhaps that's what Reish Lakish was pointing to when he thinks of the heroism of Noah, that Noah was able to hear this voice and utter this prayer. That's the Midrash on this week's Parashah. I'll take some comments or questions. We have 5 minutes before I need to disappear, but tune in next week for more of the same. I hope you've already got a taste of the sort of thing we'll be doing. Our focus will always be 1 or 2 midrashim, but I'm hoping to take you on something of a midrashic adventure around the midrash or the midrashim that we'll be looking at each week.
So far, we have only thanks and no questions in the chat. But does anyone want to either put a question in the chat or raise their hand? Give a couple minutes to maybe let people type things out.
Sure. As I gave people a lot of things to think about there.
Yeah, well there. Oh, another.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. And I'm glad that, Chai, thanks for sharing Rav Rosenzweig's website and his organization. I actually, I'm not a man of particular means. Don't go into academic philosophy if you want to be wealthy, but it's one of the few organizations I personally make a small donation to each month, because they do a lot of good, including supporting a suicide hotline, and it's certainly a cause worth supporting.
Yeah, definitely. They're doing really amazing and important work. So far, no questions. I don't know if you want to wait a little longer. Or...
Yes, I will try and do that next week, sending out the source sheet in advance. Yes. Okay. And I think in this course, I do like to make fancy PowerPoints with moving things, but I think in this course, I'm going to keep it like this, face to face, eye to eye. If you want to print out the handout beforehand, so you've got it, or put up, some people have 2 monitors now, so you can kind of concentrate on both, then great. But that's the model for this course.
Thank you. I guess we'll give people a couple more minutes. I'm just going to submit a little plug for some of the other programs we've got going on.
Okay, great. So thank you. But I will. I'm
sure.
not going to log off, but I will just say goodbye now and thank you. Yes, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lebens. This was really fantastic, and looking forward to next week. And this is just the beginning of Fall's month, so there's lots of time to. We have over two dozen classes we're running. Just
tell your friends.
Yeah, tell all your friends. Tell everyone you know, because this is so exciting. So tomorrow night, for example, we've got Dr. Sarah Ronis giving a class entitled "Mapping the Rabbinic World: Rabbis, Demons, and the Babylonian Talmud." If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what will, but I'll keep talking anyway. We also have a series of really exciting writing workshops and things of that sort, which you should definitely check out, which is really exciting. So we've got Amy Gottlieb's writing workshop coming up, which integrates the study of Jewish text, prose writing, and an exploration of themes in narrative time. And that's
which
starting
is very midrashic.
Yes. Where else are you going to get a class like that? So, so yeah, definitely look that up. And again, so many classes, so much exciting stuff happening. So please check that out. And we will see you next week. Thank you so much, Dr. Lebens, and thank you to everyone who joined.